The colder, cracked vinyl of the driver's seat was a poor substitute for a bed, a fact Jacob's aching spine reminded him of with every passing minute of the sleepless night. For the third night in a row, the monotonous, low hum of the interstate was their only lullaby, a constant drone punctuated by the violent air-shuddering whoosh of semi-trucks that blasted past their rest-stop parking spot, rocking the small pickup on its worn-out suspension. The air inside the cramped cab was thick and stale, a miserable cocktail of old coffee, damp fabric, and the faint, sweet scent of his sleeping daughter, Sophie. He cautiously pulled the thin, threadbare blanket a little higher over her small frame, his calloused carpenter's hands feeling clumsy in the delicate task. A wave of nausea, cold and sharp, rose in his throat as he looked at her face, so peaceful in the eerie orange glow of the highway lights filtering through the grimy windshield. She was 7. She deserved a warm bed, not this purgatory on wheels. He felt his heart constrict into a tight, painful knot. A year since her mother was gone, and he had failed them both. Hunger was a constant, dull ache in the pit of his stomach, a hollow feeling that had become his unwanted companion. It wasn't the sharp pang of a missed meal. It was a deep, gnawing emptiness that sapped his strength and clouded his thoughts. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, surviving on crackers, ensuring Sophie had the apple and the juice box he'd bought with his last few coins. In her sleep, she murmured something, a soft, incoherent sound, and his blood ran cold with the fear that she was dreaming of food. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making each breath a conscious effort. He glanced around the cab of the old Ford Ranger, a museum of his failures. A crack spiderwebbed across the dashboard. The check engine light was a permanent, mocking fixture. The engine itself had taken a dozen groaning, protesting turns to start that afternoon. This truck, this beat-up relic from 1998, was their only home, their only shield against the world. And like him, it was falling apart, piece by agonizing piece. He could smell the faint scent of burning oil, a constant reminder that even this last refuge was temporary. His mind drifted back a week to the final, humiliating moment. The sound of the new lock clicking into place on his apartment door was unnaturally loud, a metallic finality that echoed in the silent hallway. He remembered the landlord's indifferent gaze, the man's mouth a thin, unsympathetic line as he said the words, "I'm sorry, Jacob. Business is business." Shame burned hot on Jacob's neck as he and Sophie stood on the sidewalk, their entire world packed into 2 black trash bags and a single cardboard box. The noise of the city traffic felt suddenly hostile, each car horn a jeer. He could still feel the phantom weight of the useless key in his palm, its teeth no longer welcome in the home he'd brought his wife to, the home where Sophie took her first steps. They walked away without looking back, because looking back meant seeing the window to Sophie's room, her crayon drawing still taped to the glass. It was a wound so fresh it still bled, a raw memory that played on a loop in the darkness of the truck, reminding him that he no longer had a place to call his own. He was adrift. They were adrift. Beneath his seat, tucked away in an old, dented cookie tin decorated with faded snowmen, was everything they had left. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for it, the cold metal a shock against his skin. The lid came off with a soft pop, a sound that used to mean sweet treats but now only signaled despair. Inside, resting on the bottom, were 2 $20 bills and 1 $10, crisp and mocking in their inadequacy. $50. He stared at the bills, the faces of long-dead presidents gazing up at him. This wasn't just money. It was a countdown timer to absolute zero. It was a choice between a tank of gas to keep moving or a cheap, greasy meal that would only stave off the hunger for a few hours. It was the impossible dilemma between a night in a questionable motel with a real bed and a shower and having enough fuel to just maybe, find a job in the next town over. Each bill felt impossibly thin between his calloused fingers, a fragile barrier between his daughter and the cold, hard reality of the streets. He closed the tin. The sound was hollow, empty, like his future. A single, cold tear escaped his eye and traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He wiped it away angrily, a gesture of defiance against the overwhelming despair that threatened to drown him. He looked over at Sophie again, at the way her small chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of innocent sleep. She was the only reason he hadn't given up completely. Her existence was both his heaviest burden and his only source of strength. Right now, in the suffocating silence of the truck cab, the burden felt crushing. He felt a profound, soul-deep exhaustion that went far beyond lack of sleep. It was the weariness of a man who had fought and lost, who saw no path forward. The world outside the fogged-up windows felt vast, alien, and full of teeth. Every distant siren, every rumble of a passing truck, sounded like a predator circling. He leaned his head back against the seat, the vinyl groaning in protest, and closed his eyes. But there was no rest. There was only the image of Sophie's trusting face and the gnawing, terrifying question that echoed in the abyss of his mind. What am I going to do? The first glimmer of hope arrived in a stark white envelope, forwarded to the small-town post office box he could barely afford. The paper felt thick, important, a world away from the flimsy, poor, threatening letters printed on cheap paper that had become his reality. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and a wild, unfamiliar flutter of possibility. On the corner was the official seal of a probate court in a place he'd only vaguely heard of, rural West Virginia. His calloused fingers, clumsy and stained with grease from a failed attempt to fix the truck's engine, trembled as he tore it open. The name on the document jumped out at him, a ghost from his childhood stories, his great-uncle, Ben. He hadn't heard that name in 20 years. He held his breath, the musty air of the post office filling his lungs, bracing for another blow. It was a sensation he had grown accustomed to, that tensing of the muscles before the impact. He felt Sophie's small hand slip into his, a silent question in her touch. The dense legal language was a fortress of words, but Jacob scaled it with a desperate intensity, his eyes scanning for the phrases that mattered. Then he found them. Legally deceased, sole living relative, heir to a small rural plot of land. The words seemed to vibrate on the page, surreal and electric. A plot of land. It wasn't money, but it was something infinitely more valuable. It was a place, a foundation, a chance to build, with his own 2 hands, a life from the wreckage of the old one. He read the letter a second time, then a third, the crinkling of the paper loud in the quiet room. A sign from above. That's what it felt like. A lifeline thrown into the abyss just as he was about to go under for the last time. A wave of dizziness washed over him, a dizzying cocktail of relief and disbelief. He looked down at Sophie, who was quietly watching him, her big eyes full of concern. He tried to smile, a cracked, unfamiliar gesture. He knelt down, the floor cold against his knees. A home, he thought, the word echoing in his mind. The choice was brutal, a razor's edge of risk. West Virginia was a world away, a long, grueling drive across multiple states. The journey would devour nearly every cent of the $50 nestled in the faded snowman cookie tin, $40 for gas, $10 for survival. It was an insane gamble, a bet against impossible odds. The logical, beaten-down part of his brain screamed that it was foolish, a trip to chase a phantom. But then he looked at Sophie's worn-out sneakers and the permanent, faint smudge of dirt on her cheek. He thought of another night in the cold truck, another morning of waking up to the shudder of passing semis. This letter, this sliver of a chance, was the only light in a suffocating darkness. He folded the paper, its sharp edges pressing into his palm. The decision settled in his gut, heavy but resolute. "We're going on an adventure, Soph," he whispered, the lie feeling more like a prayer on his lips. Her face lit up, and for the first time in weeks, he saw a genuine, unrestrained smile. The click of the gas pump shutting off at exactly $40 sounded like a starting pistol. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the fuel gauge on the dashboard didn't hover on empty, but proudly pointed to the FA. The sight sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated relief through him. With their last $10, he bought a family-sized bag of potato chips, 2 bottles of water, and a small chocolate bar for Sophie. It felt like a feast. As the old Ford Ranger merged back onto the highway, the feeling in the cramped cab had transformed. They weren't fleeing anymore. They were heading somewhere. They had a destination. Sophie, buzzing with excitement, peppered him with questions. "Will there be squirrels? Can we get a puppy, Daddy? Will our house have stairs?" Jacob, his own heart lifted by her infectious joy, painted a vivid picture for her, a fantasy of a cozy wooden house with a garden for the puppy and a tire swing hanging from a big oak tree, his words building the dream he so desperately needed to be real. The monotonous grey of the interstate slowly gave way to the lush, rolling green of the Appalachian foothills. The truck, loaded with their meager possessions and their immense hopes, groaned and whined as it climbed the increasingly steep inclines, the engine protesting the strain. Jacob drove with a quiet, prayerful focus, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his senses attuned to every new noise from the beleaguered engine. He felt like a sea captain navigating a storm, his ship old and unreliable, his cargo infinitely precious. That night, they slept at another rest stop, but the familiar drone of the highway felt different, less menacing. It was the sound of progress, not stagnation. He watched Sophie sleep, her head pillowed on his folded jacket. The crisp, clean scent of pine and damp earth drifted through the cracked window, a stark contrast to the city fumes they had left behind. It was the smell of a new beginning, and for the first time in a year, he allowed a fragile tendril of hope to take root in his chest. The town, when they finally arrived, was a jolt of disappointment. It was smaller, more desolate than he had allowed himself to imagine. A single, sleepy main street was flanked by buildings with peeling paint and several boarded-up storefronts that stared out like vacant eyes. A tired-looking gas station, a general store, and the grey stone courthouse seemed to be the only hubs of activity. The few people on the sidewalk paused to watch their rusty, rattling truck pass by, their stares slow, deep, and unnervingly curious. He could feel their gazes on his back, analytical and unwelcoming. A sense of quiet, creeping decay hung in the air, a feeling of a place that time was forgetting. He pulled up in front of the county clerk's office, the grand destination of their pilgrimage, and a seed of unease began to sprout in the pit of his stomach. The bright, shining hope that had fueled their entire journey began to feel tarnished, its edges fraying under the weight of this bleak reality. The county clerk, a woman with weary eyes and a permanent slump in her shoulders, didn't even look up from her paperwork. She handed him a piece of yellow legal paper with a crudely drawn map and a few scribbled directions. The journey from the town square was a descent, both literally and figuratively. They followed a paved road that soon turned to gravel, then to a dirt track that was little more than a muddy scar on the landscape. The overhanging branches of untamed trees clawed at the truck, their sharp fingers screeching against the metal and glass. It was a hostile, grating sound that made Sophie jump. Miles ago, the last bar of cell service had vanished from his phone screen, plunging them into a profound and unnerving silence. The isolation was no longer a concept. It was a physical presence, pressing in from all sides. Jacob gripped the steering wheel, a cold dread beginning its slow, familiar crawl up his spine. This couldn't be the way. This path didn't lead to a home. It led to nowhere. The dirt track grew steeper, the ruts deeper, and filled with a thick, sucking mud that threatened to swallow the truck's worn tires. Jacob wrestled with the wheel, the old Ford groaning as it fought for purchase, the engine screaming in a high-pitched whine. The air outside grew thick and heavy, saturated with the smell of wet, decaying leaves and rich soil. It was the scent of the deep, untouched woods, a place that didn't care for men or their machines. He finally brought the truck to a halt, where the path was completely washed away, a muddy chasm blocking the way. He killed the engine. The sudden, ringing silence was terrifying. It was broken only by the incessant, high-pitched buzz of insects and the lonely, mocking caw of a distant crow. Through a tangle of thorny vines just ahead, he could see the dark shape of a building. He felt his stomach clench. He didn't want to get out. He wanted to somehow turn the truck around and flee, but there was nowhere left to run. He told Sophie to stay put, his voice a dry rasp. Pushing his way out of the cab, he stepped into the humid air and began forcing a path through the thorny thicket, the barbs tearing at his jeans and scratching his arms. And then he saw it. The sight was a physical punch to the gut, stealing the air from his lungs and replacing it with ice. The fragile bubble of hope he had protected for 600 miles didn't just break. It detonated, leaving a vacuum of utter despair. It wasn't a house. It was a shack, a skeletal ruin of blackened, rotting timbers that seemed to sag in on itself, as if sighing in its final stages of decay. A huge section of the roof had caved in, leaving a jagged wound open to the grey sky. The front porch had surrendered to gravity, collapsing on one side into a pile of splintered, mold-covered planks. It looked less like a dwelling and more like the carcass of some long-dead beast, slowly being consumed by the forest. His dream of a home lay shattered in the mud before him. The smell hit him next, a foul, physical wave that made him recoil. It was an overwhelming miasma of mildew and rot, a thick, damp odor that coated the inside of his throat and made his stomach heave. It was the deep, musty stench of a place that had been sealed and left to decay from the inside out. Beneath that was the sour, sharp tang of animal nests and the unmistakable scent of stagnant water. It was the smell of absolute neglect, of a place so thoroughly forgotten that nature itself was actively digesting it, pulling it back down into the damp, dark earth. He could almost taste the decay, a bitter film on his tongue, the last stubborn ember of hope that had survived the journey, that had flickered even at the sight of the town, was instantly and violently snuffed out by the suffocating stench of this ruin. This wasn't a project, this was a grave, and he had just spent his last dollars to travel to its edge, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He told Sophie to wait in the truck, forcing a calmness into his voice that he did not feel. He stepped onto what remained of the porch, the old wood groaning a loud, mournful protest under his boots. He feared it would give way. The front door, hanging precariously from a single rust-eaten hinge, scraped a harsh arc into the floorboards as he pushed it open. The sound set his teeth on edge. The scene inside was one of terminal decay, dark. Weeping water stains snaked down the walls like varicose veins. The floor was a treacherous landscape of seemingly solid planks interspersed with gaping black holes that revealed the damp, worm-rich earth beneath. In one dark corner, a pile of soaked rags and unidentifiable debris was matted together, clearly a nest for some small, unseen creature. He stood frozen in the doorway, listening. Faintly, from within the walls, he could hear it, the frantic, tiny scratching of rats. The full weight of the desolation crushed him. There was no electricity. Severed wires dangled from the ceiling like dead vines. There was no running water. The only plumbing was the steady drip, drip, drip of rain falling through the gaping hole in the roof, creating a growing puddle on the floor. The isolation he had felt on the drive was now a terrifying, tangible reality. They were miles from the nearest paved road, stranded with less than $10 to their name, with no cell service, and a truck that might not have enough fuel to escape this green prison. The shame was a burning acid in his throat. He had promised his daughter a home, an adventure. He had taken her hand and, with a heart full of stupid, desperate hope, had led her from the frying pan of the truck directly into the raging fire of this uninhabitable hell. His failure was absolute, a monument of rotting wood and shattered dreams. He felt a profound sense of self-loathing, cold and sharp. He backed away from the shack's doorway, the smell of its decay clinging to his clothes like a shroud. He stumbled back through the thorns, his gaze fixed on the beat-up Ford Ranger parked in the mud. The truck, their mobile prison, with its cracked dashboard and cramped cab, now seemed like a lost paradise. It was dry. It was lockable. It was, compared to this, a fortress of safety and comfort. The night spent at brightly lit rest stops, with their flushing toilets and running water, had been a luxury he had failed to appreciate. He had spent everything they had, not to climb out of the hole they were in, but to dig it deeper, to bury them in a place more remote and more hopeless than he could have ever imagined. The irony was so bitter, it tasted like bile. He had reached for a lifeline, and had instead found an anchor, dragging them down into the mud and the rot. The journey was over, and they had arrived at the very bottom of the world. He reached the truck, his steps slow and heavy, the movements of a man twice his age. Sophie was staring past him at the shack, her small face pale, her eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly turning to fear. She knew. She didn't need him to say a word. She could read the defeat in the slump of his shoulders, in the hollow look in his eyes. He opened the truck door, the familiar squeal of the hinges a sorrowful sound in the oppressive quiet of the hollow. Her voice, when it came, was small and fragile, stripped of all its earlier bright-eyed excitement. "Daddy, is that our new house?" The innocent question was a physical blow, a dagger of her own disappointment twisted in his gut. He couldn't answer. He couldn't meet her gaze. He just leaned his forehead against the cold metal of the truck's roof, the scratches on his arms stinging, the vast empty silence filled with his shame. The fight went out of him completely. The adrenaline, the desperate hope that had powered him across the country, all of it evaporated in an instant. It left behind a vacuum, a cold, crushing emptiness that was deeper and more profound than any despair he had ever known. He had thought sleeping in the truck was rock bottom, but he had been wrong. This was a new subterranean level of failure, a dark, damp place with no light and no escape. He had gambled his daughter's last shred of stability on a ghost story, and he had lost everything. He slowly slid down the side of the truck until he was sitting in the cold mud, not caring about the dampness seeping through his jeans. He dropped his head into his hands, the rough calluses of his palms scraping against his stubbled cheeks. A single, ragged sob tore its way out of him, a raw, ugly sound of a man utterly and completely broken. In the deep silence of the woods, it was the sound of a soul hitting the ground. A day bled into two. The initial storm of his breakdown had passed, leaving behind a desolate, silent landscape in his soul. But Sophie needed to eat. Sophie needed to be safe. That primal, paternal instinct, buried under a landslide of failure, began to stir. He could not fix their life, but as a carpenter, he could fix a single board. He left Sophie in the relative safety of the truck, the doors locked, with the last of the potato chips, and a promise to make the shack a little bit better. He entered the rotting structure again, the stench of decay a familiar assault. This time, however, he carried a purpose, small and fragile as it was. His eyes scanned the treacherous floor, not with despair, but with a craftsman's assessment. He would start there. He would shore up the most dangerous spots, creating one small island of safety in this ocean of ruin. He felt his stomach cramp with hunger, but he ignored it. The familiar ache a dull background noise to the task at hand. His hands, though trembling slightly, needed a task. He found a rusty pry bar among a pile of debris near the collapsed porch, its weight a familiar comfort in his palm. He decided to start near the center of the main room, where the floor seemed most unstable. A large, gaping hole, easily big enough for a 7-year-old to fall through, yawned at him. He would board it over, using planks scavenged from a less critical area. The work was slow and exhausting. The wood was damp and splintered, protesting his every effort with loud, mournful creaks. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mingling with the grime. He could feel the cold, damp air rising from the earth beneath the shack, carrying with it the thick, loamy smell of worms and decay. With each plank he tested, a wave of profound futility washed over him. It was like trying to patch a sinking ship with wet paper. The entire structure was compromised, a single rotten entity. He felt a stab of his earlier despair, sharp and painful. What was the point? The shack was a lost cause. He was a lost cause. The thought made his hands freeze for a moment. Just as he was about to give in to the exhaustion, his fingers brushed against a plank that felt different. While the others were soft and spongy with rot, this one was hard, solid, oak, he registered absently, out of place amongst the cheap, rotting pine. He pushed on it. It didn't sag, it shifted, sliding a fraction of an inch to the side with a faint scraping sound that was different from the groans of the other boards. His heart gave a strange, small flutter. It wasn't hope, not yet, but curiosity, a tiny spark in the darkness. He knelt, his knees protesting on the rough floor, and examined it more closely. There were no visible nails. The edges were cut too cleanly, too perfectly, to be a random patch. It was deliberate. He wedged the tip of the pry bar into the thin seam and gave a gentle push. Instead of splintering, the plank lifted smoothly on one side, as if hinged, revealing a dark, rectangular void beneath it. The air that rose from the opening was not the damp smell of earth, but a dry, dusty scent of old paper and enclosed spaces. A hollow compartment. He felt a sudden, sharp jolt of adrenaline, a feeling so foreign it almost made him dizzy. For a wild, irrational second, he imagined it filled with money, a hidden stash left by his reclusive great-uncle. His hands shook as he reached into the darkness. His fingers brushed against something solid, not the stacked paper of cash, but something hard and covered in a brittle, crackling material. The initial surge of hope crashed into immediate disappointment. He pulled the object out into the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. It was a book, its leather cover cracked and flaking, the color of dried blood. Next to it lay a small, heavy object. He retrieved it as well. A single iron key, small and ornate, but coated in a thick layer of orange rust. His stomach sank. No money, no quick fix, just a useless old book, and a key that likely opened nothing that still existed. The familiar weight of failure settled back onto his shoulders, heavier than before. He sat back on his heels, the dust motes dancing in the weak shafts of light. The sheer injustice of it all felt like a physical blow. To be led to this ruin, only to have his last, desperate hope extinguished by the discovery of more junk. He almost threw the book back into its hole and sealed it up forever. But his eyes caught on the key. It was pitted and ugly, but it had a distinct shape, a complex pattern on its bit. It was a key made for a specific, important lock. A loop of a question opened in his mind. Faint but persistent. A lock to what? He turned his attention back to the diary. His fingers, rough and calloused, traced the faded, embossed lines on the cover. He could barely make out the initials B, T, Ben Thorne. No, the letter from the court had no last name, just Ben Du. With a sigh that came from the depths of his exhausted soul, he opened the book. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with a tight, spidery script in faded brown ink. The first page was dated nearly 40 years ago. The ink was dense, the handwriting almost frantic. Jacob's eyes struggled to decipher the script, his mind sluggish from hunger and fatigue. Most of it was mundane, notes about weather, the price of goods in town, observations of the woods. But then, a few pages in, he found an entry that made him stop. The handwriting was different here, shakier, more urgent. It spoke of a burden, a heavy secret that was his alone to bear. "The weight is too great," it read. "I have consigned it to the well of dry tears, where it will be safe until judgment or oblivion finds me. The key will guard the treasure, but the real curse is in the pages. The truth is heavier than the gold." Gold. The word leaped off the page, electric and impossible. A jolt went through Jacob, a powerful shock that cleared the fog from his brain. A well of dry tears. What did that even mean? He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the feeling of standing on the edge of a deep, dark secret. He reread the sentence a dozen times. A well of dry tears. It was a riddle, a piece of poetry dropped into a tale of paranoia. He looked around the decrepit shack, then out the door at the oppressive, indifferent green of the forest. A well. It was a tangible object he could look for. The key in his pocket suddenly felt immensely heavy. The rust on its surface seemed to stain his fingers. This wasn't just junk, this was a map. He carefully placed the diary back into the hollow compartment, a feeling of reverence replacing his earlier disappointment. He would not risk it being damaged. He pocketed the rusty key, its cold, jagged edges pressing against his thigh. A new energy surged through him, born not of hope for a home, but of a feverish, desperate curiosity. He had to know, he had to find this well. It was the first solid clue in a life that had become a formless void of despair. He had a thread, and he had to pull it, no matter where it led. He told Sophie he was going to explore the property for firewood, a lie that tasted less bitter than the others he had told her. He needed to do this alone. He plunged into the overgrown woods behind the shack, the dense undergrowth tearing at his clothes. The air was thick and humid, buzzing with the incessant drone of insects. He moved with a frantic energy, his eyes scanning the landscape, searching for any sign of a well. The terrain was steep and unforgiving, a tangle of roots and thorny vines that seemed determined to hold him back. He felt like an intruder, a trespasser in a place that had long forgotten the presence of man. The silence was profound, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the snap of twigs under his boots. A crow called out from a high branch, a single, mocking caw that echoed through the hollow. He felt a chill despite the suffocating heat. He was being watched, not by a person, but by the forest itself. For an hour he found nothing. The land was a monotonous cascade of green and brown, a wild, untamed wilderness. His initial burst of energy began to fade, replaced by the familiar ache of hunger and the sting of his numerous scratches. The despair he had held at bay began to creep back in at the edges of his mind. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe it was the rambling of a crazy old man, a well of dry tears. It was probably just a metaphor for his great-uncle's loneliness, a poetic description for a bottle of whiskey buried in the dirt. He was about to turn back, to return to the truck and the crushing reality of his situation, when he saw it, not the well itself, but a subtle anomaly in the landscape, a small, unnaturally flat clearing, choked with a thick carpet of moss and vines, where the trees seemed to keep a respectful distance. It was barely 10 yards square, a strange patch of order in the surrounding chaos. He pushed his way through a final curtain of thorny vines, his heart beginning to pound a heavy, rhythmic beat against his ribs. In the center of the clearing, almost completely consumed by green moss, was a low circular shape, a concrete cap about 4 feet in diameter, perfectly round and starkly man-made. It was sealed tight, its grey surface stained dark with decades of rain and shadow. There was no crank, no bucket, no rope, just a flat, impenetrable-looking slab of stone and cement. He knelt and ran his hand over the rough, cold surface, scraping away the moss. It was a well, just as the diary had said, and it was sealed. Not just covered, but deliberately and permanently sealed. A fresh wave of questions crashed over him. Why would anyone seal a well? What were they trying to keep in, or keep out? He suddenly felt a profound sense of dread mixed with his excitement. He was not just uncovering a secret, he was breaking a seal, disturbing a tomb. He remembered seeing a sledgehammer lying near the collapsed porch, its long wooden handle grey and weathered. He had dismissed it as just another piece of junk, but now it was the most important tool in the world. He scrambled back to the shack, his mind racing. The short journey felt like an eternity, his legs pumping, his lungs burning. He grabbed the heavy tool, its weight both a burden and a promise. Returning to the clearing, and he stood over the concrete seal, the sledgehammer held high over his shoulder. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the humid air thick in his throat. For a moment, he hesitated. This felt like a point of no return. Breaking this seal was an act of violation, a desecration of his uncle's final, desperate act of concealment. But the image of Sophie's pale face, the memory of her small, questioning voice, pushed him forward. He had to know. With a guttural yell, a sound of pure desperation and rage, he brought the sledgehammer down. The impact was immense, a deafening crack that shattered the forest's silence. The sound seemed to hang in the air for a moment before being swallowed by the trees. A spiderweb of fractures appeared on the concrete surface. He swung again and again, the rhythmic, brutal impacts echoing through the hollow. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. His muscles, already weak from hunger, screamed in protest. The shock of each blow traveled up the handle, jarring his bones. Dust and small chips of concrete flew into the air. He was no longer just a man. He was a force of desperation, hammering against the secrets of the past. He lost track of time, his entire world narrowing to the circle of grey concrete and the searing pain in his arms and back. Then, with a final, groaning crack, a large section of the cap gave way, crumbling inward and disappearing into the darkness below with a hollow, echoing clatter. He dropped the sledgehammer, his hands numb and trembling, his entire body shaking with exertion and adrenaline. He knelt at the edge of the newly created hole, panting, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A wave of cold, stale air rose from the opening, a smell not of water or decay, but of dust, metal, and profound stillness. It was the scent of a place untouched by time, a pocket of the past that he had just violently breached. He peered into the darkness, but could see nothing. The well was deep, a black, cylindrical throat leading down into the earth. It was, as the diary had cryptically promised, a well of dry tears, utterly, completely dry. His heart hammered in his chest, a frantic bird beating against his ribs. He had to get down there. He raced back to the truck, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities. He grabbed a small car-weak flashlight from the glove compartment and the worn tow rope he kept for emergencies. This was it. The answer was down there. Tying the rope securely around the base of a thick, sturdy oak tree, he dropped the other end into the darkness. It landed with a soft, dusty thud that told him the bottom wasn't as far down as he had feared, perhaps 15 or 20 feet. His flashlight beam cut a weak, trembling circle into the oppressive blackness. He took a final, deep breath, tasting the dust on his tongue, and began to lower himself into the well. The rough stone walls scraped against his back. the rope biting into his raw hands. For a terrifying moment, he dangled in the void, the world above shrinking to a small circle of green and grey. Then his feet touched the solid bottom. He swept the feeble beam of light around the small, circular space, and there they were. Tucked against the curved stone wall were two large, olive-drab military footlockers, their metal surfaces covered in a fine layer of dust. They were stark, functional, and utterly out of place. His breath caught in his throat. He knelt before them, his trembling fingers wiping away the dust from the clasps. One of the lockers had a small, sturdy-looking padlock. The other was unlatched. He pulled the rusty key from his pocket. His hand was shaking so badly that it took him 3 tries to insert it into the lock. It resisted at first, the metal grinding with decades of disuse. He applied a bit more pressure, and with a loud, grating click that echoed in the confined space, the lock sprang open. He felt a wave of vertigo, a sense that reality was tilting on its axis. He slowly, deliberately, lifted the heavy lid. The flashlight beam fell upon the contents, and for a moment, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. There was no glitter, no sparkle like in the movies. Instead, the weak light was absorbed by a dull, heavy, yellow gleam. The locker was filled, almost to the brim, with solid gold bars, each one stamped with a weight and a serial number. He reached out a trembling hand and touched one. The surface was cool, smooth, and impossibly dense. He tried to lift it. The sheer weight of the small brick shocked him, a physical manifestation of a value so immense it was incomprehensible. It was real. He stared at the contents of the locker, the dull yellow glow seeming to pulse in the faint light. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a cataclysm. It was a fortune that could solve every problem he had and create 1,000 new ones. The hunger, the exhaustion, the despair, it all vanished, replaced by a profound, terrifying awe. His mind reeled, trying to calculate the worth, trying to comprehend the sheer, life-altering reality of what lay before him. He let out a shaky, half-hysterical laugh that sounded loud and strange in the stone chamber. It was the sound of a man whose world had just been irrevocably and dangerously shattered and remade. After a long moment of stunned silence, his mind slowly began to work again. The other locker. The diary had mentioned that the truth was heavier than the gold. Shaking, he turned his attention to the second, unlocked footlocker. If the first one held the treasure, this one held the story, the curse his great-uncle had written about. He lifted the lid, his heart pounding a different rhythm now, not of shock but of dread. There was no gold inside this one. Instead, it was packed with paper. On top lay several more leather-bound diaries, identical to the first. Beneath them were stacks of documents held together with crumbling rubber bands, geological maps marked with strange symbols and handwritten notes, and a series of yellowed newspaper clippings. A faint, musty smell of old paper and ink filled the small space. A scent of buried history. He picked up the topmost diary, its cover cold and smooth beneath his dusty fingers. He sat on the floor of the dry well, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the open books and the impossible gleam of the gold beside him. The world outside, with its green trees and chirping birds, felt 1,000,000 miles away. He had descended into this hole, a desperate, broken man looking for a solution to his poverty. He had found it. But as he looked from the silent, waiting gold to the stacks of documents filled with an unknown, dangerous history, he felt a new kind of fear, colder and more profound than any he had ever known. He understood, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that he hadn't just found a fortune. He had unearthed a secret, one that a paranoid man had buried deep in the earth for a reason, and in breaking the seal, he had likely just announced its rediscovery to anyone who might still be listening. He was no longer just poor Jacob, the failed carpenter. He was now the guardian of the well of dry tears, and he had no idea what kind of monster he had just awoken. Back in the cold, dusty confines of the well, Jacob felt the world above cease to exist. The only reality was the weak, trembling beam of his flashlight, the impossible, heavy gleam of the gold, and the musty, ancient smell of the diaries. His fingers, stained with dirt and rust, carefully turned the brittle, yellowed pages of the first journal. The spidery script documented a life of prospecting, filled with the jargon of geology and the wild, frantic hope of a man chasing a dream in the Nevada dust. He read about Ben and his partner, a man named Warren Thorne, and their unwavering belief that they were on the verge of a strike that would change the world. A knot of dread began to tighten in Jacob's stomach, a cold premonition that this story did not have a happy ending. He could hear his own breathing, loud and ragged in the subterranean silence, a stark contrast to the dead stillness of the pages in his hand. The weight of the secret was beginning to settle on him, a physical pressure in the enclosed space. It felt as if the stone walls were closing in, whispering the tale. The diary's tone shifted abruptly. The hopeful scrawl became a tight, paranoid script. The ink pressed so hard into the page it almost tore through. Ben wrote of the strike, the river of gold they had found, a geological anomaly they kept fiercely secret. But the joy of discovery was immediately poisoned by Warren's greed. Jacob read a passage that made his blood run cold. "Warren is not the man I thought he was," Ben wrote. "His eyes have a new light in them, a fever that has nothing to do with gold and everything to do with power. He talks of what this fortune can buy, who it can control. He looks at our discovery not as a blessing, but as a weapon." Jacob felt a profound nausea rise in his throat. He glanced at the silent, stacked bars of metal beside him. They were no longer a symbol of salvation. They were evidence of a partnership rotting from the inside out, a testament to a dream curdling into a nightmare. The dusty air in the well suddenly felt harder to breathe, thick with the phantom scent of avarice and betrayal from a lifetime ago. The words on the page grew darker, more desperate. Ben described two other prospectors who had stumbled too close to their secret canyon. Warren had insisted on a meeting. Ben described waiting for Warren to return, only to see him walking back alone, his face a blank mask, his hands clean. "Accidents happen in the desert," Warren had said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. But Ben had seen the fresh scratches on his partner's arms and the dark, wet stain on his boot that he'd tried to scuff away in the dirt. Jacob had to stop reading, his hand trembling so violently the flashlight beam danced across the stone walls. He felt the cold touch of the gold bars against his leg, a chilling reminder of the story's source. This wasn't a treasure, it was a crime scene. A cold, heavy stone of horror settled in his gut. The silence of the well was no longer peaceful. It felt accusatory, filled with the ghosts of men who had died for the secret he had just unearthed. The gold was blood money. The final entries were a frantic, breathless account of Ben's escape. Warren, no longer willing to share even half the spoils, had turned on him. A single, chilling sentence was scrawled across the page. "He tried to put me in the ground with the others." Ben described fleeing in the dead of night, taking only what he could carry in 2 footlockers, half of the smuggled gold and the diaries, the proof of Warren's crimes. He wrote of driving for days, never sleeping in the same place twice, his mind consumed by a gnawing paranoia. He bought the isolated plot of land in West Virginia under a false name, a place to disappear from the world, a place to bury his burden. "I have built my own prison," the last entry read. "The gold is my warden, and the fear is my cellmate. May God forgive me, because Warren never will." Jacob closed the diary, the soft thud of the leather cover echoing in the well. The story was complete, and now it was his. His inheritance wasn't just land and gold. It was his great-uncle's terror. He scrambled out of the well, his body aching, his mind reeling. He felt dirty, not from the dust and earth, but from the knowledge he now carried. He was no longer just a desperate father. He was the keeper of a 40-year-old murder secret. With frantic energy, he put everything back, the gold, the diaries, the maps, and lifted the largest broken piece of the concrete cap back into place. It was a clumsy, imperfect seal, a jagged scar on the forest floor that screamed of being disturbed. He kicked dirt and leaves over it, a futile attempt to rebury the truth, but he knew it was useless. The secret was out of its tomb, and it was alive in his mind. He stumbled back to the shack, his legs unsteady. Sophie was asleep in the truck, her face a mask of peaceful innocence. The sight of her sent a fresh wave of terror through him. The gold could give her everything he had ever dreamed of, but its story, its curse, could take everything from her, including her life. The next few days were a special kind of hell, a limbo of agonizing indecision. The immense fortune sat just a few hundred yards away, a silent, glittering promise and a terrifying threat. Jacob existed in a fog of fear, his senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves in the woods, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of ice through his veins. Was that a squirrel or an assassin? Was the caw of a crow just a bird, or was it a signal? He felt the ghost of his great-uncle's paranoia settling over him like a shroud. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. He would sit for hours in the doorway of the rotting shack, watching the impenetrable wall of trees, feeling like a cornered animal. He held Sophie tighter, his touch almost desperate. The choice was a razor's edge. He could take a bar of gold, disappear, and start a new life. But Warren Thorne was out there, a man who had murdered for this secret and had never been caught. Taking the gold was not just theft. It was a declaration of war against a monster he couldn't possibly defeat. He tried to work on the shack, needing the physical distraction, but his hands felt clumsy, his mind elsewhere. As he hammered a loose board on the porch, the rhythmic banging sounded unnaturally loud in the hollow, like a signal fire announcing his location. He froze, his heart pounding, listening to the answering silence of the forest. The isolation he had once seen as a curse now felt like his only flimsy shield. But a new sound broke the quiet, a sound so alien and out of place it made the hair on his arms stand on end. It was not the rattle of an old farm truck, but the low, powerful and expensive rumble of a high-performance engine. The sound grew closer, a predator confidently invading his territory. He felt a primal urge to grab Sophie and run, to melt into the trees, but where would they go? He stood frozen, the hammer clutched in his hand, his knuckles white. The sound stopped just where the muddy track became impassable. A car door opened and closed with a solid, heavy thud. A man emerged from behind the screen of trees. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and tailored slacks that seemed immune to the forest's grime. His hair was silver, perfectly coiffed. He moved with an unhurried, predatory grace, his expensive leather shoes navigating the muddy ground without seeming to touch it. He looked like he had just stepped out of a boardroom and onto another planet. As he drew closer, Jacob could see his face. It was tanned and lined, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and utterly cold. They swept over the scene, the rusty truck, the rotting shack, and Jacob himself, with a quick, dismissive appraisal. A thin, controlled smile played on his lips, a gesture that held no warmth, only calculation. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs. He didn't need to be told. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, exactly who this was. The ghost from the diary had just walked into his life, flesh and blood and infinitely more terrifying. "Quite the fixer-upper you've got here," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured, a stark contrast to the rustic setting. He stopped a few feet from the porch, his hands in his pockets, projecting an air of casual authority. "Warren Thorne," he said, extending a hand. "I own Thorne Mining. Most of the land around here, actually. I suppose that makes us neighbors." Jacob stared at the offered hand, unable to move. The name hung in the air between them, thick and heavy with unspoken history. He felt a wave of dizziness, the world tilting slightly. This was him. This was Warren, the man who had murdered for gold, the man his great-uncle had spent a lifetime hiding from. Jacob finally, mechanically shook the man's hand. Thorne's grip was firm, dry, and cold as stone. His smile widened slightly, but his eyes remained devoid of any light. "I saw in the county records that old Ben's property had finally been transferred. I knew him, you know, a strange man, kept to himself." Thorne let his gaze wander over the dilapidated shack again, a look of faux sympathy on his face. "Listen," he said, his tone shifting to one of confidential concern. "I'm not going to beat around the bush. This land is worthless. It's unstable. No access, no utilities. To be frank, it's a liability. But it sits adjacent to a parcel I'm looking to develop, and I like to keep my property lines clean." He paused, his cold eyes locking onto Jacob's. "I'll give you $5,000 for it. Cash. More than fair. It'll be enough to get you and your little girl a fresh start somewhere else." The offer was an insult, a pittance, but it was delivered as if it were an act of immense charity. Jacob's stomach churned. $5,000 for land that sat on top of millions in gold. The audacity of it, the sheer breathtaking arrogance, left him speechless. He knew this wasn't a negotiation. It was a test. Thorne wasn't trying to buy the land. He was trying to buy the man standing on it. Jacob's mind raced, a whirlwind of fear and fury. He couldn't accept. Accepting would mean Thorne had won, that the secret was safe, but he couldn't refuse outright either. That would be a dead giveaway that he knew something. He opened his mouth, but no words came out, only a dry, stammering sound. He felt trapped, a fly caught in a spider's web. And the spider was standing right in front of him, watching him struggle with patient, predatory amusement. He just shook his head slightly, a gesture of confused hesitation. That was all it took. The mask of the benevolent neighbor instantly dropped. The smile vanished. Thorne's face hardened, his eyes narrowing into icy slits. The air between them crackled with a sudden, palpable menace. "You should think carefully," Thorne said, his voice no longer smooth, but a low, dangerous whisper that cut through the humid air. The veneer of civilization was gone, revealing the raw killer beneath. He took a half-step closer, invading Jacob's personal space. His voice was quiet, but each word was a hammer blow. "This is a very remote place, Mr. I don't even know your name." He didn't wait for an answer. "It's a long way from anywhere. People get lost out here. Accidents happen." His gaze flickered from Jacob's face, past him to the shack, where Sophie was now peering out from the doorway, a small, frightened silhouette. Thorne's eyes lingered on her for a fraction of a second too long, and in that moment, Jacob felt a terror so pure and absolute, it almost stopped his heart. The threat was no longer veiled. It was naked, brutal, and aimed directly at the one thing in the world he had left to lose. He felt the phantom weight of the hammer in his hand, and a primal rage warred with his paralyzing fear. This man, this monster, had just threatened his child. His whole body went rigid, a coiled spring of impotent fury. Thorne seemed to sense he had made his point. He took a step back, the mask of the calm businessman sliding partially back into place, though his eyes remained hard as diamonds. "I'm a busy man," he said, his tone clipped and final. "I'll have my office draw up the papers. You have 24 hours to sign them. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." He turned without another word and walked back toward his SUV, his posture radiating absolute confidence and power. He knew he had Jacob trapped. The roar of the powerful engine starting up was a final, deafening punctuation to his threat. It faded into the distance, leaving Jacob standing in a cloud of dust and the ringing silence of the forest. His entire body was trembling, not with cold, but with a terrifying mix of rage and utter helplessness. The past wasn't buried. It was standing on his porch, and it had just put a price on his daughter's life. He stumbled back and leaned against the rotting porch post, his legs barely able to support him. The hammer fell from his numb fingers and clattered onto the boards. He looked from the path where the monster had disappeared to the open doorway where his daughter stood watching, her face a small, pale question mark. The secret in the well was no longer an abstract moral dilemma about justice and blood money. It was now the only weapon he might have against a man who held all the power, a man who would not hesitate to crush him and his daughter to protect his empire. Using that weapon, revealing the diaries and the gold, could bring the full weight of Thorne's wrath down upon them before any authority could intervene. Keeping it secret and running meant letting a murderer win and living in constant fear. He was standing on a fortune that could save them, but claiming it might get them killed. What would you do in his place? Would you run, or would you fight for a justice that had been buried for 40 years? The silence Thorne left behind was more terrifying than his threats. It was a vacuum, heavy and suffocating, where every natural sound of the forest became a harbinger of violence. The rustle of a squirrel in the leaves sounded like a footstep. The snap of a distant twig was the crack of a rifle. Jacob's heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs, a wild drumbeat of pure terror. He stood paralyzed on the rotting porch. The imprint of Thorne's cold eyes burned into his mind. The man's final, lingering gaze on Sophie was a promise, a contract written in ice. He wasn't just threatened. He was marked. The 24-hour deadline wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a countdown timer to an execution. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead, and he felt a profound, stomach-churning nausea. The world had shrunk to this one patch of mud and rot, and the walls were closing in, made of green leaves and silent, waiting menace. He was prey, and the predator had just announced the hunt. His gaze fell upon Sophie, who was still standing in the dark doorway, her small face a canvas of confusion and fear. She didn't understand the words that had been spoken, but she had understood the chilling shift in tone, the raw violence that had bled through Thorne's smooth facade. Her innocence, the one pure thing left in his shattered life, had now been tainted by this man's evil. A surge of protective fury, so powerful it almost choked him, momentarily eclipsed his fear. It was a white-hot rage that gave him a fleeting, insane desire to run after Thorne's truck with the hammer. But the fury subsided as quickly as it came, leaving behind the cold, hard sediment of reality. He was one man, with a 7-year-old child, against a wealthy, politically connected murderer. Fighting was suicide, but staying was also suicide. The air grew thick and heavy, and he could barely draw a breath. He felt his knees weaken, the weight of his impossible situation threatening to crush him right there on the porch. He forced himself to move, his actions stiff and robotic. He guided Sophie back into the relative safety of the truck, the familiar, cramped cab, suddenly feeling like the only sanctuary in the world. He locked the doors, the sound of the clicks unnaturally loud in the deadening quiet. He needed to think, but his mind was a chaotic storm of fear. He kept seeing Thorne's eyes, kept hearing his voice drip with menace as he said, "Accidents happen." He thought of the diaries buried in the well, the story of men who had simply disappeared. He was next. He and Sophie were next on that list. He looked at the crude map the county clerk had given him, the paper now crinkled and stained. His eyes traced the thin, penciled line of the dirt track. It was a dead end, a trap. But then he saw it, a tiny, almost unreadable note on the edge of the paper, marking a neighboring property 2 miles down a trail he hadn't even noticed. A single name was scribbled next to it, Silas. The name was a flicker of a candle in a hurricane of darkness. A neighbor. He had a neighbor. The idea was both terrifying and the only glimmer of hope he had. Trusting another stranger in this hostile place felt like an act of madness. For all he knew, Silas was another one of Thorne's cronies, another cog in the machine that ran this valley. But what other choice did he have? He couldn't go to the police. He couldn't stay here and wait for Thorne's men to come and create another accident. He had to take the risk. The thought of approaching an unknown farmer was terrifying, but the thought of what Thorne would do if he stayed was infinitely worse. He made a decision, the first clear thought he'd had since Thorne's arrival. He would go at first light. He would seek out this Silas, this ghost on a map, and pray he wasn't another devil in disguise. His heart pounded with a new kind of dread, the fear of the unknown, now his only possible path to salvation. He didn't sleep. He sat in the driver's seat of the Ford Ranger all night, the cold vinyl sticking to his skin, and watched the darkness. He held Sophie's small hand as she slept, her warmth a fragile anchor in the cold sea of his fear. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a man stranded on a hostile island, with monsters circling in the water. Every hoot of an owl, every rustle in the undergrowth, made him flinch. He imagined shadows moving just beyond the tree line, pairs of cold eyes watching him, waiting. The paranoia his great-uncle had described in the diaries was no longer an abstract concept. It was a living thing, breathing down his neck. The air inside the cab grew stale, thick with the smell of fear. He felt trapped, caught between the devil he knew and a stranger he had to trust. The night stretched on, an eternity of darkness and silence, punctuated only by the frantic, panicked beating of his own heart. As the first, faint hint of grey light began to dilute the oppressive blackness of the sky, Jacob gently extracted his hand from Sophie's. He couldn't risk taking her with him. If Silas was another enemy, she would be safer locked in the truck, hidden from sight. If he didn't come back, he couldn't let his mind go there. He scribbled a hasty note on a napkin, telling her he'd be back soon and not to open the door for anyone, and left it on the seat beside her. He felt a wrenching guilt at leaving her alone, even for an hour, but it was a calculated risk, a desperate gambit in a game where all the moves were bad. He quietly opened the truck door, the squeal of the old hinges sounding like a gunshot in the pre-dawn stillness. He slipped out, closing it as gently as he could, and stood for a moment in the damp, chilly air, the the faint scent of wet earth and decaying leaves filling his nostrils. The forest was still dark, a maze of indistinct shapes and deep shadows. The trail marked on the map was barely visible, a faint path that looked more like a deer run than a human track. He plunged into the woods, the branches clawing at his clothes, the air thick with a cold, damp fog that clung to everything, muffling sound and reducing visibility to a few yards. It was like walking through a dream, a disorienting world of grey and green. His heart hammered in his chest, and his breath plumed in the cold air. Every step was an act of faith and terror. He felt utterly exposed, his back crawling with the sensation of being watched. He moved as quickly as he could, stumbling over hidden roots and sliding on slick patches of moss. The 2 miles to Silas's property felt like 20, a grueling pilgrimage through a hostile landscape. The silence was absolute, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of his own blood in his ears. He was running on pure adrenaline and the primal, desperate need to protect his child. He nearly missed it. The fog was so thick that he almost walked right past the split-rail fence that marked the edge of the property. It was old and weathered, but upright and whole, a stark contrast to the collapsed ruin he had left behind. He followed the fence line, and slowly a shape began to resolve out of the grey mist. A house. It was a small, simple farmhouse, its wood siding weathered to a soft silver grey, but the roof was solid, the windows were clean, and a thin, steady plume of white smoke rose from a stone chimney. It was a sight of such profound order and care that it almost brought him to his knees. A small, neatly tended vegetable garden sat to one side, and the faint, comforting smell of wood smoke and rich soil cut through the damp air. This was a place where someone lived, where someone cared. It was the complete opposite of the forgotten grave he had inherited. He stopped at the edge of the yard, a wild, disheveled figure emerging from the mist, unsure if he was about to find salvation or simply another form of damnation. He took a deep breath to steady his nerves and walked towards the front porch. Before his foot could even touch the first step, a loud, ferocious barking erupted from behind the house. A moment later, an old hound dog, all ribs and floppy ears, rounded the corner, its lips curled back in a snarl. It stopped 10 feet away, its barks echoing in the misty hollow. The front door of the house creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was old, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his body stooped but with a wiry strength. He held a steaming white coffee mug in one hand and squinted at Jacob. His eyes, even from a distance, were looking sharp and startlingly blue. "Hush now, copper," the old man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. The dog fell silent, though a low growl still vibrated in its chest. The man's gaze swept over Jacob, taking in his torn clothes, his wild eyes, and the desperation radiating from him like heat. He didn't look welcoming. He looked wary, like a man long accustomed to trouble. Jacob's mouth was dry, his throat tight with fear. He felt like a fool, a panicked animal asking for help from a stranger who had every reason to turn him away. I'm sorry to bother you," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "My name is Jacob. I'm in the old Ben place, up the hollow." He saw a flicker of something in the old man's eyes at the mention of the name. Recognition. "I need help," Jacob blurted out, the words tumbling out in a rush. "There's a man. He's trying to take my land. He was just there yesterday. He threatened me. He threatened my little girl." He stopped, breathless, the story sounding thin and hysterical even to his own ears. He hadn't mentioned the gold, the diaries, the murders. He couldn't. It was too insane. He just stood there, panting, a desperate father pleading his case on a stranger's porch as the sun began to burn through the morning fog, waiting for the verdict. The old man just stared at him, his expression unreadable, the steam from his mug curling up into the cold air. The old man, Silas, took a slow sip of his coffee, his sharp blue eyes never leaving Jacob's face. He seemed to be weighing every word, every tremor in Jacob's voice, every wild flicker in his eyes. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the distant caw of a crow and the low growl still rumbling in the hound's chest. "A man trying to take your land," Silas repeated, his voice flat. "Happens a lot around here. What's his name?" The question was the key to the entire kingdom. Jacob's heart pounded. He had to trust him. He had no other choice. "His name is Warren Thorne," Jacob whispered, the name feeling like a curse on his tongue. The transformation in the old man was instantaneous and terrifying. The weary, cautious curiosity in his face vanished, replaced by a deep, dark shadow of recognition and gravity. The blue eyes hardened like chips of ice. The hand holding the coffee mug tightened, the knuckles turning white. He knew the name. He knew the man. "Get inside," Silas said, his voice no longer a gravelly rumble, but a sharp, urgent command. He turned and pushed the door open wide, gesturing for Jacob to enter. The command was so absolute, so filled with sudden authority, that Jacob obeyed without a second thought. He stepped across the threshold into the small, warm house. The air inside was a comforting mix of scents: the sharp, sweet smell of pipe tobacco, the lingering aroma of coffee and bacon, and the clean, dry scent of old wood. The room was simple, furnished with a worn armchair, a sturdy wooden table, and shelves filled with books. A fire crackled softly in a stone hearth. It was a place of deep, abiding peace, a sanctuary that he was about to contaminate with his violent, dangerous secret. Silas closed the door firmly behind him, the latch clicking into place with a sound of finality. "You and your little girl," he said, turning to face Jacob, his face grim, "are in a world of trouble, son." Silas gestured to a chair at the table, and Jacob sank into it, his legs suddenly feeling weak. The old man poured a second mug of coffee from a pot on the stove and set it in front of him. The warmth of the ceramic against his cold, trembling hands was a small, grounding comfort. "Warren Thorne doesn't just try to take land," Silas began, his voice low and serious. "He just takes it. He's been doing it for 40 years. Silas sat down opposite him, his weathered face a mask of grim memory. "He didn't build Thorne Mining from nothing. He built it on the bones of other people's property, other people's lives." Jacob felt a chill crawl up his spine, a cold confirmation of everything he had read in the diaries. This wasn't just a paranoid delusion from his great-uncle. It was a known fact, a dark legend whispered in the hollows, and he had just walked right into the middle of it. The coffee sat untouched in front of him, his stomach churning too violently to accept it. "Back in the 80s, Silas continued, his eyes focused on a distant point beyond the walls of the room. "Thorne was just a small-time operator with big ambitions. The richest parcel of land in this whole region, the one his own mansion sits on now, belonged to a family named Miller. Good people. They had a deed going back 100 years. Thorne wanted it. They wouldn't sell." Silas paused, and the crackle of the fire seemed to grow louder in the sudden silence. A month later, their house burned to the ground. Middle of the night. Fire department called it faulty wiring, an accident. Silas's eyes met Jacob's, and the look in them was filled with a terrible certainty. The Millers survived, but Jim Miller, he was a stubborn man. He said he'd rebuild. A week after that, he went out hunting and never came back. They found his truck by the river. They never found him. Silas's voice dropped to a near whisper. Another accident. The word hung in the air, cold and heavy as a tombstone. Jacob felt the blood drain from his face. The story was a chilling echo of what he had read in the diaries, the same pattern of violence and disappearance, just played out in a different time and place. "The sheriff," Jacob began, his voice barely a whisper. Silas let out a short, bitter laugh that was devoid of any humor. "The sheriff, son, Sheriff Brody's daddy was on Thorne's payroll, and now Brody is too. He's the most expensive piece of equipment Thorne owns. You can't go to the law in this county, because the law belongs to Warren Thorne. You're on your own." The last sliver of hope, the naive belief that there was some system of justice he could appeal to, shattered into a million pieces. He was utterly and completely alone, trapped in a web of corruption with a monster. The feeling of helplessness was so profound, so absolute, that he felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. The warm, safe room suddenly felt like a cage. He dropped his head into his hands, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He had to get out, not just out of the county, but out of the country. The diaries, the gold, that was his only chance. He looked up at Silas, his eyes wild with a new, desperate plan. "There's more," Jacob said, his voice ragged. "He had my great-uncle. He left things, proof, journals detailing what Thorne did back in Nevada, and other things." He couldn't bring himself to say the word gold. It felt too dangerous, too cursed. Silas just nodded slowly, as if he had already suspected it. Ben was always scared of something, the old man murmured. That's why he sealed himself away from the world. Silas leaned forward, his expression intent. If you have proof of what that man is, then you have the only thing that can stop him. But you can't stay here. He's not a patient man. That 24-hour threat wasn't a deadline for you to think. It was a promise of when he would stop being polite. You need to get your girl and that proof. And you need to be gone from this valley before he comes for you. The urgency in Silas's voice was a physical jolt. The old man was right. Thorn wasn't waiting. He had already shown his hand, and now the clock was ticking faster than ever. Jacob pushed his chair back, a frantic energy surging through him. I have to go back. I have to get Sophie and the proof. He was already moving toward the door, his mind a whirlwind of terror and logistics. How could he get the footlockers out of the well and into his truck without being seen? How could he carry a 7-year-old child and a bag full of evidence through the woods? Be careful, son, Silas warned, following him to the door. Go fast, but go quiet. He might already have men watching the place. The thought sent another spear of ice through Jacob's heart. He might be walking back into a trap. He burst out of the farmhouse and back into the woods, the morning sun now bright and uncaring. He ran, his lungs burning, the trees a green blur around him, his mind screaming one single thought: Sophie. He arrived back at the clearing of the shack, breathless and drenched in sweat. The hollow was quiet, too quiet. The Ford Ranger was still there, a silent, rusty sentinel. He peered through the grimy window. Sophie was still asleep, curled up on the seat, a small, peaceful island in his ocean of terror. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. He hadn't been discovered. Not yet. He had time. But as the sun began its slow descent towards the western ridge, casting long, menacing shadows across the forest floor, a new sense of dread began to build. Night was coming, and with the darkness, he knew Thorn's monsters would come out to play. He had to work fast. He had to get the evidence from the well, get Sophie, and be gone before the last light faded from the sky. The race against time had begun in earnest. The work was brutal and frantic. He used the tow rope from his truck and the remaining strength in his exhausted body to haul the 2 heavy footlockers out of the well, one at a time. The metal screeched against the stone lip of the well, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet woods. His muscles screamed, his hands were raw and bleeding, but the fear drove him on. He dragged the heavy boxes through the undergrowth back to the shack, his heart pounding with the exertion and the constant, gut-wrenching fear of discovery. He hid the locker full of gold deep in the woods, covering it with branches and leaves. It was too heavy, too dangerous to take. He would come back for it later, if there was a later. The other locker, the one with the diaries, the proof, was the one that mattered now. It was his only weapon, his only shield. He dragged it into the shack, the musty smell of the rotting wood and the old paper mingling in the air. As the sun finally dipped below the ridge, plunging the hollow into a deep, velvety darkness, Jacob knew he had run out of time. He had transferred the diaries and maps into a sturdy canvas bag. He had woken a groggy and confused Sophie, trying to explain that they had to leave without terrifying her. He was in the shack, his hand on the bag, his other hand holding Sophie's, about to make a run for the truck, when he heard it. It started as a low rumble, a vibration he felt more in his teeth than his ears. It grew steadily louder, the distinct sound of heavy-duty truck engines, not on the distant main road, but right here, on his dirt track. The sound was a death knell. They were here. Headlights, powerful and blinding, suddenly swept across the front of the shack, cutting through the darkness and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The trucks ground to a halt right outside, their engines idling like growling beasts. The world went silent for a beat, the engine noise replaced by the frantic chirping of crickets. Then, 2 truck doors slammed shut, a percussive, violent sound that shattered the night. Heavy, crunching footsteps on the gravel and dry leaves outside. Not the measured tread of one man, but the clumsy, confident swagger of at least 2. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over Jacob, cold and paralyzing. He pushed Sophie behind him, his body instinctively forming a shield. He felt her small body trembling. "Jacob!" A voice boomed from outside, rough and laced with a drunken belligerence. "We know you're in there. Mr. Thorn sent us to collect what's his." They weren't being subtle. This wasn't a threat, it was a home invasion. The flimsy, rotting door was the only thing between his daughter and the violence that was about to unfold. His blood ran cold. His mind went utterly blank with fear. A loud, scornful laugh came from the porch. "What is this piece of junk?" another voice slurred. Then came a violent, splintering crack as a heavy boot kicked the door. The wood shattered around the latch, but the door held barely. Jacob grabbed the bag of diaries, his mind finally kicking back into gear. There was no fighting. There was no reasoning. There was only flight. "Come on out, boy," the first voice yelled. "Don't make us tear this whole damn shack down." Another kick, louder this time, and the door flew off its single remaining hinge, crashing to the floor with a deafening clatter. In the blinding glare of the headlights, Jacob could see the silhouettes of two large and menacing figures framed in the doorway. They hadn't seen him yet, tucked in the deep shadows of the back corner. They were scanning the main room, their movements slow and predatory, while the two henchmen took a step inside, their boots crunching on the debris-strewn floor, their attention focused on the empty front of the shack. Jacob made his move. He knew there was a section of the back wall that was little more than rotten planks and tar paper. It was his only way out. Gripping Sophie's hand so tightly his knuckles were white, he whispered, "Run, and don't look back." He turned and slammed his shoulder against the weak wall. The rotten wood gave way with a groan of splintering timber, and they tumbled out into the pitch-black darkness behind the shack. He scrambled to his feet, pulling a terrified, sobbing Sophie with him. He had the bag with the diaries slung over his shoulder. On pure, primal instinct, he reached into his pocket and his fingers closed around the single gold bar he had taken from the well. It was heavy, a solid piece of proof. "Hey, what was that?" he heard one of the men shout from inside. He didn't wait to hear more. He plunged into the woods, into the absolute, unseeing blackness of the forest at night. The sounds of angry shouting and splintering wood erupted from the shack behind them. But he didn't look back, he just ran. The forest that had been menacing by day was a terrifying, living nightmare at night. Unseen branches whipped at his face, thorns tore at his clothes, and roots seemed to reach up from the ground to trip him. He held Sophie's hand, half dragging, half carrying her as she stumbled and cried. The only light was the impossibly distant, faint glimmer of a single bulb he knew was on Silas's porch, a tiny, far-off star of hope in a universe of darkness and terror. The shouts of the men grew fainter behind them, replaced by the sound of his own heart hammering in his ears, Sophie's panicked sobs, and the desperate, crashing noise of their flight through the unforgiving woods. He ran with the desperate, primal terror of a hunted animal. Every shadow was a monster, every sound the footsteps of his pursuers. He could feel the cold, heavy weight of the gold bar in his pocket and the strap of the bag cutting into his shoulder. They were the weight of his past and the only hope for his future. The air burned in his lungs, his legs felt like lead, but he couldn't stop. He had to reach Silas. He had to get to that light. He could hear the men's shouts again, closer now, as they began to search the woods with flashlights. Beams of light cut through the trees, sweeping back and forth like prison searchlights. He ducked behind a massive oak tree, pulling Sophie closer, trying to muffle her terrified cries against his chest. He could smell the damp earth, the sharp scent of pine, and the coppery tang of his own fear. He was trapped between the pursuers and a wall of impenetrable darkness, with the life of his daughter in his hands. The henchmen were crashing through the undergrowth, their movements clumsy and loud. "He can't have gone far," one of them yelled, his voice alarmingly close. Jacob knew they couldn't stay hidden for long. He had to move. He scanned the darkness, his eyes searching for the faint light of Silas's farm. It was still there, a tiny beacon of hope. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, he decided to abandon the faint trail and cut directly through the steepest, most difficult part of the woods, praying his pursuers would stick to the easier path. He scooped Sophie up into his arms. She was impossibly heavy, but the adrenaline surging through his veins gave him a desperate, unnatural strength. He scrambled through the thicket, the noise of his passage masked by the sounds of the clumsy men behind him. He was a ghost, a father fueled by terror, running from the monsters in the dark, his only goal to make it out of the woods and into the light. His foot caught on a root, and he went down hard, his body slamming into the damp earth, his arm twisting to cushion Sophie's fall. A cry of pain escaped his lips. For a terrifying second he lay there, the air knocked from his lungs, the bag with the diaries digging into his back. The flashlights behind them swept closer, their beams cutting through the trees just yards away. "Over there, I heard something!" a voice shouted. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. This was it. They were caught. He scrambled to his knees, ignoring the searing pain in his ankle, and pulled Sophie up with him. He couldn't carry her anymore. "Run, Sophie, run to the light," he gasped, pushing her ahead of him. He limped behind her, a wounded animal trying to draw the predators away from its young. The sounds of his pursuers right at his heels. The light from Silas's farm was closer now, a warm yellow square in the darkness. It was so close, yet so impossibly far. They burst out of the tree line and into the clearing of Silas's farm. The sudden open space felt vast and terrifyingly exposed. The light from the porch was a beacon, just 100 feet away. He could see the silhouette of Silas standing there, a rifle in his hands. "Here! Over here!" Jacob screamed, his voice raw and broken. Behind them, the two henchmen broke through the trees, momentarily blinded by the porch light. They were huge, hulking figures, their faces twisted with rage. One of them raised a handgun, the metal glinting in the light. Time seemed to slow down. Jacob saw the dark hole of the barrel. He saw Sophie just a few feet from the safety of the porch. He saw Silas raising his rifle. He did the only thing he could. He threw himself sideways, shoving Sophie the last few feet towards the old man, and braced for the impact. The roar of the gunshot that would end his desperate flight. The deafening roar of Silas's rifle tore the night apart, a sound far more powerful and final than the henchman's pistol. It wasn't a warning shot. In the blinding flash, Jacob saw the gunman's silhouette jerk violently. A choked cry ripped from his throat as the handgun clattered onto the porch boards with a sharp, metallic clang. The second man, seeing his partner collapse clutching a shattered knee, froze for a half-second in stunned disbelief before turning and crashing back into the blackness of the woods, a panicked animal fleeing a superior predator. "Get in, now!" Silas yelled, grabbing Jacob's arm and hauling him toward the door. The searing pain in Jacob's twisted ankle exploded, but he barely registered it. He scrambled inside, pulling a hysterical, sobbing Sophie with him. The warm air of the house enveloped them, smelling of wood smoke and cordite. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, the bolt sliding home with a solid, definitive thud. The immediate assault was over. Silas moved with a calm efficiency that belied his age, while Jacob sank into a chair, his body trembling uncontrollably as he held a still sobbing Sophie. The old man ignored the wounded man groaning on his porch and went directly to a corner of the room. He pulled back a simple quilt hanging on the wall, revealing a powerful, antiquated ham radio, its dials glowing a soft, eerie green in the dim light. "My nephew works for an Appalachian justice group in DRC," Silas explained, his voice low and steady as he expertly tuned the dials. "He specializes in corporate vultures like Thorn." The air filled with the crackle and hiss of static. Jacob, his mind still reeling, fumbled in his pocket and placed the heavy gold bar on the table. He then pushed the canvas bag of diaries across the wood. The objects felt like offerings on an altar. Then a voice, clear and professional, cut through the static. "Silas, this is David. I hear you. What's the trouble?" It was a voice from another world, a world of laws and order. "I need you to listen very carefully." David's voice crackled from the speaker, a calm anchor in the sea of chaos. "You are not to leave that house. The local authorities are compromised. I'm handling this on a federal level, but I need evidence I can use right now." He instructed Jacob to use Silas's old, beat-up flip phone to take pictures, photograph the cover of each diary, the entry mentioning the murders, and the one about his escape, then photograph the gold bar next to one of the pages. Jacob's hands, raw and shaking with adrenaline, felt clumsy as he handled the brittle pages. Under the warm glow of a single oil lamp, he carefully aimed the phone's primitive camera, the click of the shutter seeming impossibly loud. He captured the spidery, desperate script detailing Thorn's first sins, the tangible proof of a 40-year-old crime. With each blurry photo he sent into the ether, he felt the burden shifting, the crushing weight of the secret slowly lifting from his shoulders and moving into the hands of an invisible, powerful ally. In a sterile, brightly lit office building 200 miles away in Washington, DMC, David worked through the night. The grainy photos that arrived on his smartphone were more than enough. He didn't just have a client. He had the case of a lifetime. The digital images, coupled with his organization's existing files on Thorn Mining's suspicious land acquisitions, were presented to a federal prosecutor before the sun had even risen. The narrative was explosive, a trail of disappearances and murders stretching back 40 years, a corrupt local government, and a massive, untaxed hoard of gold. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, was invoked. It was the legal equivalent of a nuclear weapon, designed for precisely this kind of entrenched, systemic corruption. By dawn, a quiet, meticulously planned operation was in motion. Unmarked black vehicles, filled with grim-faced FBI agents in tactical gear, were already speeding silently down the Interstate E. A wave of legitimate, overwhelming force rolling toward Thorn's private kingdom. Warren Thorn sat on the marble veranda of his sprawling mansion, the morning sun glinting off his silver hair. He was wearing a silk robe and holding a porcelain cup of coffee, reading a financial report with an air of absolute dominion. He was a king in his castle, untouchable. The first sign that his reign was over was not a sound, but a flicker of movement on the edge of his perfectly manicured lawn. Then chaos erupted. Black-clad figures swarmed the property with silent, shocking speed. A glass door shattered. Before Thorn could even stand, he was surrounded. "Warren Thorn, you are under arrest." The voice was cold, impersonal, and held an authority he could not buy or intimidate. His arrogant disbelief curdled into a mask of pure, venomous rage as the cold steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. The king was dethroned, not by a rival or a market crash, but by the ghost of a partner he'd tried to bury 40 years ago. In that moment, he wasn't a titan of industry. He was just an old murderer, finally caught. Guided by a pale but resolute Jacob, a team of federal agents descended into the dry well. The air of reverence and dread he'd felt in the stone chamber was replaced by the clipped, professional chatter and the bright, powerful beams of forensic flashlights. They photographed the scene. The two footlockers sitting in the dust like ancient sarcophagi. An agent wearing latex gloves carefully lifted the lid on the unlocked box. The diaries and maps, the paper heart of the entire conspiracy, were meticulously bagged and tagged as evidence. Then they opened the second locker. A collective, low whistle went through the agents as the light hit the dull gleam of the gold. It was real. It was all real. As they catalogued each heavy bar, Jacob stood at the edge of the well, the morning sun on his face, and felt a profound release. The secret was no longer his to carry. The ghosts of the well were finally free, and in a way he hadn't expected. So was he. The weight of the past was finally being lifted into the light. The legal battle was swift and brutal. Ben's diaries, authenticated by forensic analysis, served as a chilling confession from beyond the grave, providing a roadmap for investigators. They reopened the accidental deaths and disappearances that had paved Thorn's path to power, including the case of the Miller family. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the threat of the death penalty, several of Thorn's former associates, including the disgraced Sheriff Brody, turned state's evidence. Warren Thorn was convicted on multiple counts of murder, racketeering, and conspiracy under the RICO Act. He would spend the rest of his life in a federal supermax prison, a powerless old man haunted by his ghosts. The gold, valued in the tens of millions, was seized by the U.S. Treasury. But as David C., Silas's nephew, explained to Jacob, federal law provided a substantial reward for his role as the whistleblower whose cooperation was instrumental in dismantling a major criminal enterprise. The number he quoted was so large it seemed unreal. It was not a treasure. It was justice. 6 months later, the smell of cut grass and blooming roses filled the air. Jacob stood on the porch of his new home, a sturdy two-story house on a quiet, to a tree-lined street 1,000 miles away from the West Virginia hollows. There was no rotting wood, only fresh white paint. There was no mud, only a lush green lawn where a brand-new swing set stood waiting. He held a warm mug of coffee, his hands steady, the calluses softened. The constant gnawing ache of hunger in his stomach was a distant, faded memory. He could hear, through an open window, the sound of Sophie's laughter. She was in her own room, a bright, sunny space filled with toys and books, a universe away from the cramped stale cab of the Ford Ranger. The oppressive hum of the interstate was gone, replaced by the gentle chirping of birds and the distant, happy shouts of neighborhood kids. He wasn't a failure hiding in a truck. He was a father standing at the door of his own home. He was safe. The scent of fresh-cut pine and sawdust was the smell of his new life. Jacob ran his hand over the smooth, sanded surface of the wood, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. His new workshop, situated in a spacious, converted garage, was his sanctuary. It was filled with new tools, their steel gleaming, each one in its proper place. He was no longer a desperate, unemployed carpenter looking for scraps. He was a craftsman, with a waiting list of clients who admired his skill. He was finishing a beautiful four-poster bed for Sophie's room, a piece built not from necessity, but from pure love and artistry. He looked out the large window of the workshop. In the backyard, Sophie was soaring high on the swing set, her hair flying behind her, her face alight with pure, carefree joy, a profound sense of peace, a feeling he thought he'd lost forever, settled deep in his soul. He had not just given his daughter a home, he had given her back her childhood. The promise he had made to his wife, in the silence of his heart, was finally kept. Later that evening, the kitchen was filled with the warm, savory aroma of roast chicken. Jacob placed a plate filled with food in front of Sophie, who was diligently coloring at the big wooden table, a happy smudge of purple crayon on her cheek. The tableau was one of simple, beautiful normalcy, an impossible dream made real. He looked from his daughter's smiling face to the comfortable warmth of their home, and a wave of gratitude so intense it made his eyes burn washed over him. The cold, cracked vinyl of the truck seat, the gnawing hunger, the suffocating despair, it all felt like a story that had happened to someone else in another lifetime. He was here now in the light. From a rusty truck to a loving home, Jacob's journey shows that even in the deepest darkness, a single discovery can bring hope. His story of resilience and justice is a reminder that the human spirit, when fighting for what it loves, is unbreakable. If tales of overcoming impossible odds inspire you, subscribe to our channel for more stories of redemption.